Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Day's Digital Festival. This event will begin soon, but first we have a brief housekeeping message. So that you can get the most out of this session, we'd like to point out a few features of Zoom. By clicking on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will be able to access the chat room, and if you are in a webinar, you will also be able to make use of the Q&A function. The Q&A function is so that you can ask specific questions of the speaker, which they will be able to answer time allowing at the end of the session. Use the chat room to contribute more generally to the discussion or to share links and resources. When using these features, please mind your P's and Q's. Both will be monitored and recorded. Most sessions will be recorded and uploaded to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival YouTube channel and website. If you're in a meeting, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute unless otherwise directed by the host. If, for some reason, the session ends unexpectedly or you lose connection, please just click the link again and wait to be let back in. Similarly, if the host loses connection, please bear with us. We will do our best to manage any connection issues as and when they occur, and may contact you by email if necessary. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear about your experience of our digital festival. Fill out our survey to be in with a chance of winning a prize. Our survey is available at www.glasgowdoorsopendayfestival.org.uk/survey. We hope you enjoy this event.
With over 6 million articles on English Wikipedia alone and an estimated 52 million articles in 309 languages, Wikipedia is a well-established force in the world of free knowledge. But there are gaps on Wikipedia which reflect areas of structural inequality in society. What I want to talk to you about this afternoon is how people in Scotland and beyond are telling untold stories of history and heritage through Wikipedia, and how you can raise up those voices and communities which have been left out by structures of power and privilege by becoming a Wikipedia editor. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr Sara Thomas. I am the Scotland Programme Coordinator at Wikimedia UK. My job is normally to travel all around Scotland. At the moment, I'm doing it through Zoom, zooming around Scotland, being enthusiastic at people about open knowledge. I work with galleries, libraries, archives, museums, educational institutions, and a volunteer community to promote and to encourage the use of open knowledge and engagement with the Wikimedia Projects across Scotland. This is a slide here from a wonderful group of people called Visual Thinkery, and they go to conferences and the guy who works with them, he illustrates the main points that come out of conferences. This is one that came out of the EduWiki summit that we had at Coventry University a little while ago, and it's a really good phrase, and it's one that I absolutely adore. This notion of being a knowledge activist. And it comes from a student at the University of Edinburgh called Lucas, who talked about his love of doing things on Wikipedia. And he said that when he saw something and he realized that he could add it to Wikipedia, that he could become an activist of knowledge. And that has really stuck with me. I really like the idea that one can become an activist, that one can operate on Wikipedia by filling gaps in Wiki and to become a knowledge activist. What I'm going to talk about just now is just a little bit of structure around what we mean by the Wikimedia Projects. Lots of people use Wikimedia and Wikipedia interchangeably, and that's not really the case. You will have all heard of Wikipedia on the top left here. You may not have heard of some of the rest of these projects. Wikimedia Commons over here is where we keep all of the photos, all of the video, all of the audio. Wiki Books is where we keep textbooks. Wiki Source is where we keep out of copyright books. And Wikidata is the kind of newest kid on the block. Wikidata is 7-8 years old now, and it is a home for structured, linked, open data. All of these projects are volunteer run. We don't have any mass bank of staff editors sitting writing articles. All of these are driven and run by the community. The Wikimedia Foundation is the worldwide foundation that kind of stewards all of these projects. And I work for Wikimedia UK, who are the UK chapter of the movement. One of the things that I think it's really important to kind of get over at the start is that Wiki can make a difference, and that in editing Wiki can make a difference. If you ask Alexa a random question, almost all of the time Alexa will be asking Wikipedia. There is a lot of some research that's been done recently to suggest that terminology that gets put into Wikipedia in scientific research then starts to surface elsewhere. It's important that we edit, and it's important that the things that end up in Wikipedia really reflect the knowledge that we would like to have out in the world. This plaque here is a plaque that now sits at the Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh, and it was put there after a long piece of research and a whole bundle of activity done by people from the University of Edinburgh to talk about the Edinburgh 7, Britain's first medical students. The first time I heard about the Edinburgh 7 was at the first ever Wikipedia Editathon. It's an event where everyone gets together to edit Wikipedia around a particular subject. And that editathon was taking place at the University of Edinburgh, and it was on the subject of women in medicine. And that's when I first heard about these incredible women. The Surgeons' Hall riot occurred on, as you can see, the 18th of November 1870, when these women, who were the first to matriculate to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh, were tried to go and sit an anatomy exam, and they were pelted with fruit. There was a riot because, God forbid, a woman should want to be a doctor. One of the outcomes was that we found out more about the Edinburgh 7. And the more that we could get that information into Wikipedia, the more well-known it became. And it's not the whole reason, but part of the reason that we now have that plaque up on the side of the Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh is because of being able to kind of raise awareness of this project, of these people, sorry, through Wikipedia. This is a study called Wikipedia Matters that was tweeted to me a couple of days ago, and was a piece of research that was done July of last year that shows that you can impact which cities people go to, and that you can improve tourism if you have a well-written Wikipedia article. So if you have a Wikipedia article that's well-written, has a couple of decent paragraphs about particular European cities, in this case, that you can increase footfall to those cities. It really does matter what we put online and how discoverable things are. This is a slide that I've shamelessly stolen from my colleague Ewan McAndrew, who is the Wikimedian in residence at the University of Edinburgh. And he shows this feedback loop quite succinctly in this slide. That if things that are more visible, so when you get things onto Wikipedia, they become more visible in things like Google. We increasingly rely on search, and search increasingly relies on Wikipedia. Once you get something into Google, then it's more likely to be written about, for example, in the press, and therefore more likely to be seen by the general public, and therefore more likely to be written about, for example, on Wikipedia. Now you have a media source, as Ewan says here. So there is this feedback loop. There is a danger, however, that the rich get rich and the poor may disappear entirely. There is an opportunity cost to not having historical information on Wikipedia. When it comes to recent events as well, it's important to realise that people are looking for good quality, accurate information. These are some user stats. I've taken these from the back end of a couple of Wikipedia pages about coronavirus. And you don't need special access to get these. You can just click into the back of a Wikipedia page and it will show you it. And this shows the number of page views for people who are looking for information on coronavirus, so this bit here, during February to the end of March of this year. So page views, a daily average of 274,000, but in that period of just over 2 months, 14.8 million people looked for information on coronavirus on Wikipedia. Now, if I click over onto the next slide, there we go. Coronavirus disease 2019, page views of 6.8 million during the same period, and a daily average of 127,000. And if we look at the one for the 2019-2020 coronavirus pandemic, then we see that around about the median there is 1.1 million people. This one is a little bit odd. As you can see, it wasn't created until the 12th of March, but between the 12th of March and the 25th of March, 15.6 million people looked at the Wikipedia article for 2019-2020 coronavirus pandemic. The point about this is that's the TLDR, is that people are in search of information, and society should have free access to good quality, reliable information. I think it's become a bit of a truism that we keep getting asked to make big decisions on the basis of incomplete and inaccurate information, and that is not good enough. If we want a better society, we need a society in which we are able to access high quality and accurate information. In the point of coronavirus, it's probably worth mentioning that Wiki Project Medicine, so anything that's biomedical that ends up on Wikipedia, certainly English Wikipedia, has the highest standard of proof of anywhere in the encyclopedia. You can't just throw in a conspiracy theory or an outlier study and expect it to stick. It's really carefully moderated and looked after. And that's because we know that people increasingly rely on search, and search increasingly relies on Wikipedia. If you've just been diagnosed with something, then the first thing that people tend to do is go to Google. And if the information there leads you to Wikipedia, it's really important that the information there is as accurate as it can be. That has a really serious effect on people's lives. We say that Wikipedia is the encyclopedia that anyone can edit, and that's true. Anyone can log into Wikipedia. You don't even have to make an account. You can log in and you can make a change. But that doesn't mean that you can say just anything. And as I'm going to go on to describe and to talk about some of the gaps that we have on Wikipedia, some of the knowledge gaps and what we're doing to address that, it's really important to understand the foundation of how it is that Wikipedia works. Wikipedia has what we call these 5 pillars, which is a really terribly grand way of saying some really, really obvious stuff. The first of which is that Wikipedia is an encyclopedia. So far, so simple. But really what that means is that it's not a mirror for your own website. It is not a place for, it's not a soapbox. It's not a place for conspiracy theories. It is a place, it is an encyclopedia. The second pillar of Wikipedia is that we look for neutral point of view. So insofar as that is possible, we are looking for just the facts. We want to stay away from exaggeration and speculation. We are looking to see, Wikipedia is a tertiary source based on reliable secondary sources and some primary sources. And that means that we want the information there to reflect what is known about a particular subject. So what already exists in general knowledge about a particular subject. Wikipedia is free content that anyone can use, edit and distribute, and we are part of the open knowledge movement. We want people to be able to take this information and use it elsewhere. We also require Wikipedia editors to be respectful and civil towards each other. It is often easy to forget that people on the other side of a computer screen are real people. And you'll often see the acronym AGF used in Wikipedia discussions. That means assume good faith. We are, after all here just to create an encyclopedia. And the last pillar of Wikipedia is that there are no firm rules. We are a community, we work by consensus. If something needs to change, then it can do. I'm going to come back a little more to talk about neutral point of view, because this will inform a little bit about what I talk about later. NPUV is one of these kind of guiding core principles of Wikipedia, and it means, this is the definition that I've taken from that particular guideline, which means representing fairly, proportionately, and as far as possible, without editorial bias, all the significant views that have been published by reliable sources on a topic. Now, reliable sources means something in particular. Reliable sources, we are looking for things like peer-reviewed journals, academic textbooks, broadsheet newspapers. We want to stay away from things like self-published blogs, although there are always exceptions. We probably would stay away from tabloid newspapers. We would probably stay away from self-published sources in general. And this is because we are trying at all points to defend the integrity of the encyclopedia as far as is possible. Reliable sources and citations are what I call Wikipedia gold. The idea is that Wikipedia, you can go to the bottom of your article, have a look at a source, and use that as a springboard for further study. Wikipedia is the place where you start. It's not necessarily the place where you finish. Notability is another one that it's worth having a little bit more detail on. Information on Wikipedia must be verifiable. If no reliable independent sources can be found on a topic, then it should not have a separate article. Wikipedia's concept of notability applies this basic standard to avoid indiscriminate inclusion of topics. Article and list topics must be notable or worthy of notice. This is important. It's important that people can't just go and put a Wikipedia article on for their pet or their partner as a birthday present, or their dad's band that plays in a pub. It's important that we have this standard of notability, that people have reached a certain level of standing that allows them to have a Wikipedia article. And generally, we talk about this as the general notability guideline, that people must be fairly extensively covered in secondary sources that are independent of them. So not just their own website, but other people have talked about them, and that they have influenced things, for example, or that they are important or have won awards, for example. That can be one particular thing. But this has a few issues, which we'll come on to, because not all history is made equal. There are knowledge gaps off Wiki. Sourcing and the way that history is constructed and written, and the way that certain types of knowledge are given more authority than others, can re-entrench existing knowledge gaps, existing structural bias. As they occur off Wiki, they will have that impact on Wiki. I was looking on the National Records of Scotland website the other day, looking at a few different incredible resources that they have. And I came across this talking about the information that they have available on slavery and the slave trade. And it was a real reflection to me about how the history of enslaved peoples at the moment is generally written by those, or is reflected through the eyes of those who enslaved them, because that is where the historical record lies. So here, for example, not much is known about how former slaves integrated in Scottish society, how they felt about and utilised their freedom. This is because there are very few first-hand accounts in Scottish archives left by former slaves. We also know, for example, that slave markets and auctions are one of the places in which we can find out information about the enslaved, but that is written and taken from the point of view of slave traders and other slave owners. And the same is true for plantations. Where the history is hidden, the historical record becomes a rigged game. And when we are looking for reliable sources upon which to base Wikipedia articles, this gives us a problem. It also gives us a problem in other ways. This is an extract from an article written in 2016 by Alistair G. Tough in the Journal of Archives and Records Association, entitled Thinking About and Working with Archives and Records, a Personal Reflection on Theory and Practice. It's a reflection on archives and records theory based on the author's 40 years of experience in the industry. And he opens the paper with this. The author began work in 1975. A senior colleague gave him two memorable pieces of advice during his first week in the archives profession. Firstly, he was told never to waste time on women's papers. Secondly, he was urged to make sure that anything he earmarked for disposal was actually destroyed, and that no evidence of the matter was kept, lest historians should make a fuss about it later. Clearly, conventional thinking about archives and records has moved on significantly over the past 40 years. So part of the issue that we have here, and there are many, many reasons for this, but part of the issue that we have is that sources for men's history are much easier to come by than those for the history of other genders. Not just because these records may simply have been destroyed, as in this example, but because the way in which that history which survives has been written is in such a manner as to deprioritize the achievements of women. And that becomes a feedback loop in terms of study, in terms of research, and in terms of public consciousness. The game is again rigged. So what happens then when we have a historical game that is rigged or that has holes, and we come to trying to write articles for Wikipedia because we want to get hidden history into public consciousness, and we know that we can do that by writing articles on Wikipedia? This presents us with some problems. We end up with knowledge gaps on Wiki. And we end up with knowledge gaps on Wiki for a couple of reasons. There was a piece of research done a little while back that looked at the demographic of Wikipedia editors. And in general, we have almost exclusively male editors. Our editors are overwhelmingly white, they are overwhelmingly Western, and they do not necessarily reflect the breadth of the demographic of the information that we want to produce, that we want to present on Wikipedia. If we have a more diverse editor base, we hope that we will have more diverse content. This is one of the ways in which we seek to close the knowledge gaps on Wikipedia. There is one particular measure of the gender gap on Wiki, and that is the number of biographies of women that exist on English Wikipedia. Back in 2015, I believe it was just shy of 15%. There have been several campaigns, one long-running campaign called Women in Red, which I'll talk a little bit about later, who've been working on this for the last few years, and they've managed to move that percentage bar, and that now stands at just over 18%. But that still is a really long way to go. Now, the Wikimedia Foundation realizes this, and the Wikimedia community realizes this, and it's now been reflected in the strategic direction of the Wikimedia Foundation. This is the one for the Wikimedia Foundation. The one for Wikimedia UK follows very, very closely behind. And I'll draw your attention to the last point there about knowledge equity. So as a social movement, we will focus our efforts on the knowledge and communities that have been left out by structures of power and privilege. We will welcome people from every background to build strong and diverse communities. We will break down the social, political, and technical barriers, preventing people from accessing and contributing to free knowledge. And here is where learning, and here's where contributing to Wikipedia intersects with agency. And here is how editing Wikipedia can become a political act. It becomes an act of activism. This is a quote from Dr. Allison Littlejohn, who did some research on that. In fact, the Women in Medicine editathon that I was talking about at the beginning with the plaque from the Surgeons Hall. And she did a couple of bits of research on the process of people becoming Wikipedia editors. And this quote is one that has stuck out with me ever since I read that paper, that learning becomes personal, triggering forms of agency. Moving from being a passive consumer of knowledge to being an active producer of knowledge. That's the key shift that we're talking about here. And it's a key shift in the way that we think about ourselves, in the way that we approach information. Because being involved in producing knowledge, in writing those articles, gives you agency and insight to a degree which is simply not possible from the subject position of a passive consumer of knowledge. So here's what I want everyone to do. This is my not so secret agenda. I want you to become a knowledge activist. I want you to create a Wikipedia account and edit Wikipedia and help us fill those gaps in knowledge. Because that's the only way that we can produce the world's knowledge for free, is by having the world take part. I want you to become a knowledge activist. Wiki Project Women in Red. I'm going to now show you a few examples of projects that we've worked on, and the sort of meat of what I wanted to talk about, of groups who are raising up those forgotten voices, of groups that are specifically attacking hidden history, that are telling untold stories. Women in Red was started by two people who had actually never met at that point. They were at, I believe, opposite ends of the globe. One of them now lives in Scotland. That looked at this very particular gender gap, looking at systemic bias within the Wiki movement and what we could do to combat that. So yes, in October 2014, only 15.5% of English Wikipedia's biographies were about women. And as of September 2020, we're now at 18.57%. But that is still a huge amount. That is a huge amount of work that they have done, but there is still a huge amount of work to be done. Now, this is a group of people, there's quite a large group of people who edit regularly. They have an incredible set of resources on their Wiki project page. I highly recommend that you have a look if you are interested in editing about women's history and about biography in particular. Then I would highly recommend that you get involved with Women in Red. They're called Women in Red because if you have a red link on Wikipedia, it means the article doesn't exist yet. And the aim of this project is to turn red links blue. There is another group here, just to stick with the gender gap, that are called Art and Feminism. And Art and Feminism have been running since 2014, adding information about women artists and connected subjects to Wikipedia. So they've been running since 2014. I think there's over 7,000 people at over 500 events. And this slide is a little bit out of date, so it will be more than that by this point, have participated. This is a campaign that they run along excellent lines. They have wonderful community organizing. And this campaign has produced over 11,000 articles created or produced so far. This is one way in which we can fill a knowledge gap. This woman, Emily Temple Woods, was Wikipedian of the Year in 2016, has created over 400 new articles during her Wikipedia editing career. She found she was getting trolled, and anytime she got trolled, she responded by going to create another Wikipedia article. She seems like an awesome lady. I would also give note here to Dr. Jess Wade. Dr. Jess Wade creates a Wikipedia article every day. She's a physicist. How she finds the time, I have no idea, but having met her, she is a force of nature and she edits Wikipedia every day, creating Wikipedia articles about women in STEM. This group was something that was really very special to be a part of, the Brave Edit campaign with Amnesty International. This was a worldwide project, but in particular, I worked with Amnesty Scotland. And the idea of this editathon was to get information about women human rights defenders up and in the encyclopedia. This was a really interesting one to approach. I went to speak to a group of Amnesty International activists at their conference up in Dundee, be a few years ago now, to talk to them about editing Wikipedia and to talk to them about the ways in which they can contribute to knowledge. And again, this idea of becoming a knowledge activist by editing Wikipedia. Now, women human rights activists is an interesting one, because there are some people working in that area that don't want their names to be known, that don't need their names to be known because it could actually put them in danger. So part of the work that Amnesty International did was to kind of find out whether or not that would be okay. And as a participating organisation, they did a lot of work, a huge amount of work with some of their volunteers to find sources, reliable sources that we could use for Wikipedia articles. And then we held a series of editathons across the world, I think, and certainly all over the UK. I was just involved in the ones in Scotland to get this information up and in Wikipedia. This is one of my favourite groups to work with, Protests and Suffragettes. They've actually, I'm really pleased to say, they're running a crowdfunder and it closed at midnight on Monday and they made their target. I'm just exceptionally pleased to see what they've managed to do. I'm absolutely delighted that they've managed to reach that target. They are going to be sending out information, zines, education packs to schools across Scotland with information about Scottish suffragettes. I've been working with this group now for, oh goodness, 4 years, 5 years, maybe, on and off. And in fact, we had an event with them just last Thursday. This is a community heritage group. They are based out of Govan and they are researching the history of Scottish suffragettes to do and women to do, so connected with the Red Clydesides, and they are particularly interested in Mary Barber. You can see a picture that one of the group members there, Leslie Mitchell, had taken of the statue of Mary Barber just outside Govan subway. They are interested in the hidden histories, the untold stories of these women. What's been really interesting to me is that this group is fantastic. This group do art walks, they produce materials, they do talks. One of the things that we've started doing and that we have developed as practice over the last few years is that their archival research, their historical research, that they carry out. One of the outputs of that, one of the parts of their workflow, is now to update Wikipedia articles with that information. It's become a bit of a truism that become quite common, sorry, that many heritage projects get funded to do digital things, and then you have a digital output, and then that sits there for 4 or 5 years until the website disappears, until the website goes away, or nobody has the money to host it anymore, or the information goes out of date. And it's lovely to have that moment, that couple of year moment, when you get that information up there. But getting things into Wikipedia, and this is something that I've discussed with Tara Beale, who's a socially engaged artist that works with the group, and others, we've worked on a couple of projects, is that getting information into Wiki gives these kind of projects longevity past the end point of funding, past the end point of the project itself. Once you get that information into Wiki, it keeps on going, and it has effects beyond just the reach of your group. So as this group find out more about Scottish suffragettes, Scottish suffragists, about women involved in 1915 rent strikes, they get it into Wikipedia. Now, some of that information is suitable for Wiki because it's coming from, say, newspapers and archives, and some of it isn't. Some of it is things like oral histories, which at the moment are a little bit difficult in terms of how do you put them into a Wikipedia page. But this is part of their research and part of their knowing that if they can get that information into Wiki, it will become better known. We can get those page views up there, we can integrate that information into the encyclopedia. So as I said, we had an event just last Thursday, and we're starting to have these kind of semi-regularly now, that we get together with this heritage group, and one of them has been through our Wikimedia UK training, and we start to edit on a regular basis, and we have 20-30 people each time coming to those, and we're teaching people how to be Wikipedia editors with all the digital skills that are entrenched in that, but we're also getting this helping people to get that historical research out into Wikipedia. And it is wonderful and amazing to see that community here around that activity. There's also this kind of activism. This isn't about history or heritage, but I did want to put this one in just at the end because it, to me, is quite interesting in terms of other kinds of activism that you can do through Wikipedia. And in terms of this here, I would like to talk about activism against dis and misinformation. As I said before at the beginning, it is incredibly important that people have access to high quality, accurate information. And we are in an age when we are bombarded with, I hate to say the phrase fake news, but it is the one that is commonly used, that we are bombarded with inaccurate information or deliberately misleading information, that the information that we put out about ourselves is often used against us in sometimes a malicious way. And we can fight that by providing people with access to high quality information. This particular Wiki project, COVID-19, is a sub-project of Wiki Project Medicine. And they have been really busy over the last little while, as I'm sure you can imagine, particularly at the beginning of lockdown, getting in high quality information available out to on those pages which concern coronavirus. This is kind of my core point, really, that engagement with the Wikimedia projects is a form of open education for civic engagement and democracy. It is important, I think, that people are engaged in the process of creating knowledge as much as they are engaged in the process of consuming knowledge. We want to address gender gaps on Wiki by getting more editors on board from a wider demographic. We need to challenge and keep on challenging on Wiki bias and finding technical as well as content ways to do that. We're looking at targeted campaigns, looking to address particular gaps, things like the gender gap, for example, was targeted through Women in Red. And targeting particular knowledge gaps around history, heritage, and untold stories. And the way that we do that is by getting new and different and varied people involved. So please get involved and be a knowledge activist. Thank you very much. I finished much earlier than I thought I would do. Okay, if anyone has any questions, I am going to stop sharing my screen just now, and I will take any questions that come up. give everybody a little while just to think about that. One example that I didn't use actually in there was an article about the Tinker's Heart of Argyll, which is a Wikipedia article that I wrote a little while back. And the Tinker's Heart of Argyll is the only physical monument to the travelling community in Scotland. And in the oral tradition, it goes back to the Jacobite Rebellion, but there aren't any published sources. And this was a real issue when it came to getting that particular monument listed. They had to go to HES, and there was a campaign, I think over about a year and a half, to take the oral tradition on the same level as written sources, and did eventually get that monument listed. We have a couple of questions in here. How do you address the wiki bias when students are told not to use or trust Wikipedia? This is a good one. Yeah, what we say in general, so we have Wikimedians in residence at universities. We have one at the University of Edinburgh, and there is also one at Coventry University. And we've previously had a Wikimedian in residence at one of the university in Wales. I think it's Cardiff, but it was before my time, so just in case I got that wrong, apologies to my Welsh colleagues. And the thing that we keep on saying is that we want students to write Wikipedia, not cite Wikipedia. And we've been doing a lot of work. Part of my job is around literacies, and working with digital literacies, information literacies, all these kinds of things, particularly with students. Writing Wikipedia is a really good way to train to do public outreach. You've got to write in a format that is accessible. I find actually postgraduate students are really good at this, and professors who've been around tend to struggle with it because they tend to write in more jargon. So we have an entire programme of education projects up and down the country, up and down the entire UK, that deals with different universities and is showing how Wikipedia can play an active part in learning. In fact, all of the Wikipedia projects, we do a lot of, we do some data science work with Wikidata, for example. So an example project will be something like, let's see, there was one that was run at University of Edinburgh again. All my good examples come from University of Edinburgh today, where they were writing about reproductive biology. It's reproductive biology, and there was a term called neuroangiogenesis, which did not exist in the encyclopedia. And so we took the students through, these are, I think, first year students. We took them through the process of, okay, so this is what a Wikipedia article should look like. These are the do's and don'ts. We don't want you to cite Wiki, don't want you to cite an encyclopedia, but here's the point, we want to find you the sources. And then you split the group up into different sections. One of them will take the introduction, one of them will take the midsection, one of them will take the end. And then you go off and you teach them and you show them, okay, so this is how you use databases. This is how you do database searching. This is how you look at source analysis. This is how you assess whether or not this source is reliable. And now convert that into your own words. And then section by section, then they put up these sections onto a Wikipedia article. So you've been able to do digital skills through that process. You've been able to teach research skills. You've been able to teach writing skills, things of putting it into your own words, and source analysis, and also database searching. So we do a lot of advocacy around these particular around these particular subjects. We also, handily, this is next to my desk, have produced this booklet here called Wikimedia in Education. This was co-produced between the University of Edinburgh and Wikimedia UK, and has a whole bunch of case studies in it and some information about different skills that people can learn. If anyone's interested in doing anything with a school or a university or college or anything like that, or any sort of educational thing, please drop me an email. I will put my email in the chat. Yes, I can. All panelists and attendees. Hang on. Cool, that's my email address there. I would totally love to have any conversations that people have, conversations with people for questions that they have. Would it be appropriate to write an article about a group to which you don't belong? That could be sensitive, no matter how well-meaning the author is. Yeah. In terms of group, I'm not sure, Morag, if you mean, say, like a demographic group, for example. It's interesting. I think all things, especially biographies, need to be approached with sensitivity, and it's important to write. I think to remember that when we're writing a Wikipedia article, we're writing from encyclopedic tone. So we should be reporting facts, and we should be reporting about what's already known about people. But certainly that must be done with particular sensitivity. So, for example, if I was going to write about somebody that I only would hear about from an oral tradition, say something like a Native American person, I know that I don't know very much about that, and I am aware that there may be issues about putting things from an oral tradition into a written tradition. So I would want to go and think really, really carefully about that. Julie Gibbs has asked, have I worked with many museums? Yes, I have. I used to be the Wikimedian in residence for Museums Galleries Scotland, and then I was the Wikimedian in residence at Scottish Library and Information Council. So I worked with a whole range of different museums there, and the work there varies. We can look at getting images of collections openly licensed and up into Wikimedia Commons, which means that they can be seen by everybody, reused by anybody, which is really important for out of copyright works, for example. I recently did a little bit of work with the National Museum of Scotland. They had some excellent images of the Lewis chessmen that they released on an open license, which now are on the Lewis Chessmen page. But then also another Wikipedia editor kind of came along and saw, hey, somebody's managed to get some incredible open licensed images of the Lewis Chessmen, and these are really good quality images. And then they created an entirely new Wikipedia article because the depth and detail of those images meant that they could start a new article about some of the detail of the game pieces of the Lewis Chessmen. Any untold stories or hidden histories you're aware of relating to Glasgow that you think are crying out for a wikithon? Yeah, I would really like to do something around the built environment and the history of slave trade in Glasgow. It's something that I think I've done a little bit of research into what information is available. And what information is on Wikipedia, and I know that there are gaps. I can see that there are gaps. I would love to find people to work with on this, and people who understood the history better than I did. I want to find people who are interested and who have the knowledge and the skills, the knowledge about the content, and I will happily teach them the Wikipedia skills. I think there is a huge amount of Glasgow history, in many respects, actually also in industrial history. There's a couple of gaps in there for things I've been looking at. So if anyone's interested in that, please drop me a line. I would be Tony Lewis at Kelvin Grove and Panel. Cool. Grand. Yeah, I'd love to get involved there. I'm always happy to be rented out as a trainer. Very, very happy to come and provide training for free for any groups that are looking to do this. It's part of my job. Also, we got role of archivists. Have you seen any projects similar to protests and suffragettes where archives can cite their own records to create improved entries as an institution? Does it need to be individual staff members? So anyone that edits Wikipedia always edits as an individual rather than as an institution. We don't have kind of in the same way that you would have like an organizational Twitter account. We don't kind of have that. And that's because, again, it's trying to get away from this idea of paid editing and conflict of interest editing and all this sort of thing. But you could totally have an individual archivist who, as part of their work, would be able to go in and cite particular things. We would want to be very careful about conflict of interest, and we would probably want them to say, they don't have to have necessarily their real name, but they could say something on their talk page to say, hey, I work at this archive. They could go on to the talk page of particular articles and say, hey, if anyone's got a question, I can totally go find out for you, for example, if that's part of their outreach work. Creating entries as an institution depends on what you're creating entries as. And again, we have to be very, very careful that we're not biasing the encyclopedia. But yes, people who work at cultural institutions, I would always heartily please do get in contact and learn more about editing. It's a really good way for us to be able to provide good quality links to archives, to collections that Wikipedia editors are usually crying out for, to be like, hey, we want the sources, we want to be able to write about this. How much do I write about my research without being self-promotion? Well, being Wikipedia, there is a, let's have a look. Being Wikipedia, there is actually a guideline on that, and it is, let me just have a look. I'll share my screen while I try and find it. And it is Wikipedia self-cite. It is self-reference, self-cite. I think it's that one. Self-reference, inappropriate self-references. Anyway, okay, right. I'll find the thing and they're citing sources. Citing oneself. Yeah, can't find it just now. Sorry about that. There is a guideline on Wikipedia basically for citing stuff that you have written yourself. And basically what we need to say, what we would say about that is write about, it's totally fine to cite your own work if it is a reasonable addition to the article. If you're going through and taking out every other citation to every other author and only putting in your own research, or indulging in like obvious edit warring with, I don't know, a competing researcher, then we definitely would prefer that you didn't do that. However, if you are the world expert in squirrel taming and you have access to and you know a lot about the concept of squirrel taming, if your research is the best in the world and it's put in with sensitivity, at least like not in complete self-promotion, then yeah, that's fine. I would generally advise people to flag on the talk page that you have cited your own work, but hopefully that you have done it within reason. Okay, what are my thoughts on the written languages of Wikipedia pages? For example, some pages are only available in English. Yeah, so English Wikipedia is the biggest of all of the language Wikipedias. We have 309 now, of which around about 300 are active, and they reflect completely different communities. So just because there's an article in English does not necessarily mean that there will be an article in Scots or in Chinese or in Vietnamese, for example. And you also find that those articles will reflect a slightly different history. So the English page on the Vietnam War is very different in some ways to the Vietnamese page on the American War, as they call it. So it does reflect these intricacies and these nuances of different cultures. This is what I mean about when we come to neutral point of view. True objectivity is quite difficult to come by. I think that people should definitely edit Wikipedia if they speak different languages. I think it's really important that we have information going from other languages into English as much as we have going from English into other languages. Otherwise, we risk this kind of cultural overwrite if we only have things going one way. English Wiki is the oldest, it is the biggest, it is in some ways the most bureaucratic. But it doesn't mean that it's the only one that we should do things on. So yes, I absolutely, completely would encourage people to edit in other languages if they could. If anyone has any other questions? It's grand. Okay, well, that's us at 20 past. I did finish a little bit earlier than I thought I would do, but thank you so much to everybody for coming. It's been lovely. And thank you very much. Hope you have a lovely rest of your Tuesday. I hope that there are some other that you get to see some of the other Doors Open Day stuff. I do encourage you to please become a Wikipedia editor and check out some of those projects that I talked about. And hope you have a lovely day. Thanks very much. Bye.